and I am talking today about the Supremacy Clause, an introduction to Article 6 of the Constitution, something that it seems like everybody's talking about a little bit these days, but almost everyone seems to get it wrong. They ignore or miss part of the Supremacy Clause, and it gives it a whole different view. Here, for example, from Cornell Law School, they say Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution is commonly referred to as the Supremacy Clause. It establishes that the federal Constitution and federal law generally take precedence over state laws and even state constitutions. So it's basically the general concept that as long as the federal government passes something, it takes precedence over state law all the time. And really, most people just really kind of read it like that. They say federal law is always supreme, or federal law is always supreme if the states try to do anything that conflicts with it or interferes or gets in the way, anything that even remotely looks like the states are doing something that the feds are claiming the power to do, it's automatically federal law is always supreme. But this couldn't be more wrong. And I think it's important to start out by reading this paragraph from Article 6 of the Constitution. And it says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding." So, the key phrase that everyone seems to miss, here's how Mike Meharry puts it in an article, Understanding Federal Supremacy. He says, absolute federal supremacists tend to completely ignore three key words in the Supremacy Clause: in pursuance thereof. And you can see it in the text there. It says, all the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof of the Constitution. And you go back to Cornell Law School. This is a leading law school in the country, and they don't say about pursuance thereof. Their lead sentence is federal law just generally overrides state law. Meharry continues. He said, the clause does not read, "This Constitution and any old act Congress decides to pass shall be the supreme law of the land," but that's how most people read it. Only acts, Mike writes, within the scope of the federal government's delegated powers rise to the status of the supreme law of the land under the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause. So let's take a look at how Alexander Hamilton put it in Federalist number 33. And I like going to Hamilton on things like this, even though he was a flip-flopper, but he was arguing in support of ratification. And so the people that he was writing to in New York were ratifying under this perspective. And he said, the clause which declares the supremacy of the laws of the Union, like one we have just before considered, only declares a truth. It doesn't add anything extra, according to Hamilton. It's just reinforcing the structure of how things are supposed to be. He said, which flows immediately and necessarily from the institution of a federal government. It will not, I presume, have escaped observation that it expressly confines this supremacy to laws made pursuant to the Constitution. So he's kind of used all caps. If you see it up here on the screen, expressly and pursuant to the Constitution is in all caps. And it's that's pretty clear, straightforward stuff. William Davey in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention put it this way: it can be supreme only in cases consistent with the powers specially granted and not in usurpations. So federal law is always supreme as long as it is in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution. And there's not a ton of those. St. George Tucker, in his View of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1803, it's the first extended legal commentary on the original legal meaning of the Constitution. We can say it's pretty much the Jeffersonian view of the Constitution. Not exactly, but pretty close. Tucker here has a long passage where he explains the whole purpose and understanding of the clause in more detail. And let me go through this. Maybe I'll add some commentary in between. He said, it may seem very extraordinary that a people jealous of their liberty and not insensible of the allurements of power. So he's recognizing, of course, that the people want to protect liberty, and they also recognize that power is very dangerous. Power expands, and the allurements of it means it draws the worst people to it. So when you live under the largest government in history, like they had gone through then, like we do now, the people who are trying to get in power really are just not the best of the best. But says it's kind of weird that they should have entrusted the federal government with such extensive authority as this article conveys, controlling not only the acts of their ordinary legislatures, but their very constitutions also. So that seems like a big deal, and it was certainly a big deal. He said the most satisfactory answer seems to be, though, that the powers entrusted to the federal government, being all positive, enumerated, defined, and limited to particular objects, there can in these respects be little room for collision or interference between the states, whose jurisdiction may be regarded as confined to their own domestic concerns, and the United States have no right to interfere or exercise a power in any case not delegated to them or absolutely necessary to the execution of some delegated power. Absolutely necessary is how St. George Tucker is really defining the necessary and proper clause, and maybe I should cover that in another episode. I try to do these big clauses of the Constitution from time to time and add a little different perspective because it's so important that we keep hammering on this founding original message. So he's saying, like, look, they have only been delegated certain stuff, and there's a reason that they agreed to delegate this stuff to the federal government. And when they're going to do stuff, if you're going to authorize to do stuff, they got to have supremacy in that sphere alone. Everything else, he's saying here, like, they can't do anything that's not delegated to them, and otherwise they're interfering with the states. He said a law limited to such objects as may be authorized by the Constitution would, under the true construction of this clause, be the supreme law of the land. But a law not limited to those objects or not made pursuant to the Constitution would not be the supreme law of the land. And get this, but an act of usurpation and consequently void. So a usurpation of power is an exercise of power not delegated because power flows from the sovereign people of the several states. The people are the fountain of all power, whether it's Light Horse Harry Lee saying this, Robert Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams even. You get all kinds of people pointing this out. George Mason, of course. If the power comes from the people and government is only acting as the agent of the people of the several states, it's not up to the government to decide whether the government has gone beyond those limits, which is another episode, but certainly if they go beyond the powers that the people have given to it, then they are stealing some of the sovereignty or final authority from the people. So this is an act of usurpation and consequently void. It's not supreme law. That's the only time is supreme is if they follow the Constitution. Now, I'm going to be linking to all this this stuff in the show notes. Alan Mosley will organize the blog post for this episode. We publish one a couple of hours after the live stream is done for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find for each episode, you're going to find not only all the platforms we're on, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and X and LinkedIn. And we also live stream on Odyssey.com and Rumble.com. And we archive the video all over the place. We have the audio only podcast edition everywhere. And I appreciate you, whether you're listening or watching on whatever platform, whether it's your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one in TBH. I have not even been here for every single one since day one, but I do my best. So that'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty in a couple of hours. But I do want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Looks like I had a little struggle with the connection here this morning getting it started, but hopefully I've got this resolved. I'm trying to do some multi-streaming to some other platforms at the same time. And to be honest with you, if you're experiencing some buffering or issues at the beginning of a stream or I have to restart it, it's generally me screwing something up here. So I'm trying to figure out the right way to do things. But hello over to Haji and Dixie Strong, Howard, Rick, Melanie, Eric, Cheriton, Lou, Lewis, Senator DT, Kirk Morrison, Mr. Huntus Spokes, I think, and everyone else. Lewis Tart, I appreciate you guys all being here. Thank you again for watching or listening to the show. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where the blog post with all the reference links are going to be for this episode. Now let's get back to this discussion about the Supremacy Clause. The federal law is supreme when in pursuance of the Constitution. We hear this over and over and over. And even when you go to the biggest big government guy of the time, Alexander Hamilton, He says that as well. But we also have some of the top legal minds. For example, James Iredell, who was nominated to be one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court by George Washington. Here he is in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He says, what is the meaning of this? Talking about this Supremacy Clause. There was some debate about this in North Carolina specifically. He said, what is the meaning of this? But that as we have given power, we will support the execution of it. That's the description of what they are saying, why they did this. So if you're going to have the federal government have the ability to do stuff in a certain sphere, it has to have the ability to just do it. That's the whole point. He said, we should act like children to give power and deny the legality of executing. You can read the whole thing. It'll be linked in the show notes, but it's a pretty nice take there. He says, then when the Congress passes a law consistent with the Constitution, it is to be binding on the people. If Congress, under pretense of executing one power, should in fact usurp another, they will violate the Constitution. Again, here's Iredell using the same type of language that St. George Tucker used some years later in 1803. This is July 28, 1788, in that North Carolina ratification debate. He said, look, if they go beyond that limit, this is usurpation. Usurpation is not just like, oh, we did a little overreach. I know a lot of people, when they talk about federal power, and I do this too, we talk about like, oh, here's some federal overreach. Like they just kind of pushed in a little bit too far. But usurpation is a much more powerful term, especially at the time. Maybe not today, because people don't really think in terms like this. But this is stealing sovereignty. Usurpation of power is a nasty thing. St. George Tucker also in that same book referred to it as treason against the sovereignty of the people. So an exercise that of power that is not delegated is a usurpation. Here's Governor Johnston in North Carolina that same date. He says, I do not know. There was some debate over the use of the term pursuance, like, oh, this is hard to define. And he says, I do not know a word in the English language so good as the word pursuance to express the idea meant and intended by the Constitution. Can anyone understand the sentence any other way than this? When Congress makes a law in virtue of their constitutional authority, it will be an actual law. And the implication there is if they make a law that is not within their constitutional authority, it is not a real law. It is void, a usurpation of power. He says every law, this is again Governor Johnston in North Carolina, every law consistent with the Constitution will have been made in pursuance of the powers granted it. Every usurpation or law repugnant to it cannot have been made in pursuance of its powers. The latter will be nugatory and void. We see this term over and over, void, void. It doesn't count. Now, it's not going to be void just by saying, hey, you guys did the wrong thing, because if you're thinking about this, they're recognizing that there may or will be a time when Congress would pass stuff that goes beyond the limits of the Constitution. Now, ultimately, and this is for other episodes, which I've covered many times, ultimately, things aren't void just by yelling the word void, hey, you're not authorized to do this, or asking the federal government to tell us or to admit that the federal government was doing stuff that it wasn't authorized to do. Oh, sorry, and now we're going to stop. They never seem to do that. There's a whole process that the people in the states need to go through to make it void in practice when government is the bad guy. Maybe that's maybe that's all the time. But back to James Iredell. Oh, no, this is Hamilton, I think. He said, but it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. Again, even Hamilton, this is Federalist 33, which will be linked to in the show notes. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. And that gets a little bit into what I was getting at just a moment ago, talking about Iredell and Johnston. You know, if an act of usurpation is void, again, they're going to try to do this from time to time. The structure of the Constitution was supposed to limit that, at least for a period of time, according to Benjamin Franklin, and then eventually it wouldn't do it because you can't rely on words on paper to do the job. It's up to the people, and if the people are corrupt, then they're going to put corrupt people in power who do all kinds of nasty stuff. But ultimately, the way that you deal with the act of usurpation is you recognize that it is void. It is not law. It is not an actual law. It is usurpation of power, it is theft, and it deserves to be treated that way. So sometimes when you've got a robber, you don't want to face them head on. It depends on how violent and powerful they are. You may want to undermine them or make it difficult for them to get away with what they're doing in other ways. And that's how you have to kind of look at federal power as well. So that's Hamilton in Federalist 33, and he reiterates this. Now, Federalist 33 was, was that still in 1787? No, January of 1788. So months later during the New York Ratifying Convention, which is where the Federalist Papers did not have much influence out of the state of New York. So we give it an outsized influence here, but it's interesting to me to at least see the opinions that people like Hamilton were sharing. Now, here he is in the New York Ratifying Convention where he primed the pump for so many months with those Federalist Papers to try to overcome the anti-Federalist objections. They did win there. But here's how he put it again. This is June 28, 1788. The laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere. Now, let's look at this. I'll go back a little further. The acts of the United States, therefore, will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the general government. But the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere. And when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme or binding. And it doesn't matter if all the branches of the federal government tell you they are supreme or binding acts. If they are not within the bounds of the Constitution, because the people have the final say, they are the ultimate arbiters. They are the parties to the compact. And so they have the final say of whether or not their own compact has been violated. So they are not supreme or binding. Now, most people miss this, but the Supremacy Clause really exists for two main purposes. And if you read it with the full context of it and understanding of why they did it and what was going on, it tells us two main purposes. One, to ensure the supremacy of the Constitution. Because if they are making laws necessary and proper for carrying out those delegated powers, this is the legal doctrine of principles and incidental powers. I've given examples recently talking about the power to establish a post office. If you can establish a post office, but you can't hire, it doesn't say, well, you can hire the people to run the post office, or you can rent the land, or you can, sell stamps to run the mail, things like that. It doesn't spell out every single thing. These are considered incidental powers, basically things, as St. George Tucker said, that are absolutely necessary to carrying out the delegated power. So we're ensuring the supremacy of the Constitution, not just anything that the federal government does, as long as they're in pursuance of the Constitution. And then they're also drawing a line around federal power. People look at the Supremacy Clause as an extreme expansion of federal power, but really it is a harsh limit on federal power if you read it properly and the people actually support it the way it's supposed to be. That's something that's been missing. So instead of giving Congress additional unlimited power to do whatever they want, federal law is always supreme, the Supremacy Clause simply addresses the legal status of laws that other parts of the Constitution empower Congress to make, as well as legal status of treaties and the Constitution itself. It's above everything else. But again, it's very limited. Now, if you take into account how many powers are delegated versus everything else that's reserved, that means the notion that federal law is always supreme really pretty much gets it totally backwards. Not 100% backwards. It's not that state law is always supreme. But in most situations, federal law is not supreme because most stuff has not been delegated to the federal government. Here's how James Madison described it. Federalist 45, again, for a New York audience, but still, this is Madison's take, and you can find many others throughout the ratification debates that echo this exact same position. He said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So as far as powers that government could, might, or do exercise, in almost all the situations, other than, I know some people say there's only 17 powers delegated to the federal government. Some people say there's 18. Really, if you read throughout the document in various places, of course, Article 1, Section 8 is the primary reservoir of powers delegated to Congress. it's 17 plus necessary and proper, or 18. There's generally between 30 and 35 powers, depending on how you count it. 30 to 35 things that the federal government is authorized to be involved in. Everything else is reserved to the states. So of all the things that might affect the lives and liberties of the people, it's like less than a percentage. So if you really said state law is always supreme, you would actually get the Constitution far more correct than Cornell Law School. So the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will for the most part be connected. Again, James Madison. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So, short version, federal law is always supreme is totally wrong. Federal law is always supreme. Well, the Constitution is always supreme, and most federal law is not in pursuance of the Constitution. And that's the issue that we're really running into. So really, if you take this whole thing in conjunction between Madison's view and, again, Madison, this is just an example of how basically everyone selling the Constitution described federal power. Few and defined, those powers which are delegated to the federal government, everything else is automatically reserved. So if it's not there, if it's not an incidental power to what has been expressly delegated, they cannot do it. And so, I mean, of course, that's not how it's played out in practice because words don't enforce themselves. But the idea that federal law is always supreme, again, almost a complete 180. Here's how John Taylor of Caroline put it. In Construction Construed and Constitutions Vindicated, I know my friend Brian McClanahan just did an episode on John Taylor, which I've missed because I jumped forward to some other stuff that he's been doing. If you're looking for another show or podcast to check out, Brian McClanahan does great stuff on history and the Constitution. But here's how John Taylor of Caroline put it. The United States have no authority except that which is given by the Constitution. Both the laws and treaties to be supreme must, therefore, be made in conformity with the powers bestowed, limited, and reserved by the Constitution, and by these we must determine whether a law or a treaty has been constitutionally made before the question of its supremacy can occur. Again, as long as they're within the powers delegated, which are few and defined, federal law is always supreme. But the notion that federal law is supreme until the federal government tells us that the federal government did something that was not supreme, we're going to be waiting for generations before it decides to do that. Maybe once every few decades, they tell us, whoops, sorry, that thing that we've been doing for 30, 40 years, well, we weren't really authorized to do that. Sorry, too bad we ruined so many lives. But that's not how you're supposed to really deal with it. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. Hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something because nothing helps us get this kind of work out to more and more people. These foundational, original, legal meaning of the Constitution, principles, along with how to defend the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. Nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. And you can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing it, throw it our way. No one punches above their weight class better than the TAC. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There's also annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. Kirk Morrison has had a really good comment that must have just scrolled by. Basically said the Constitution is only going to be as good as or enforced as much as the people stand up for it. Someone saw that. I saw that scrolling through, and I think that's pretty good. Speak Life Garden Homestead and Permaculture. I like that screen name. Over on YouTube says, please make a video on that process to deal with it when they usurp power. If you scroll through our channel or 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, there are probably somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen of these, but I do definitely do them regularly from time to time. You want to start looking at things like James Madison's advice in Federalist number 46, where he said, how to deal with federal power that goes beyond the limits of the Constitution. He gave us a 4-step plan. None of them involved going to the federal government to try to convince the federal government to magically do what the federal government never does, which is limit its own power. He said the states and the people need to use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. States need to use legislative devices to help them out. Thomas Jefferson, some years later, told us every time they exercise powers not delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Voting the bums out to Thomas Jefferson was only to be used when they were still within the bounds of the Constitution, but you didn't like how they were implementing policy. So that's not a situation we're in today. James Iredell, again, in that North Carolina ratifying convention, he told us that the only resource against usurpation, again, the only resource, according to one of the Supreme Court justices, first ones on the Supreme Court, the only way to deal with usurpation, not just a good idea, not something to try later, the only way to deal with usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. Mercy Otis Warren also told us that we have to resist the first approaches of tyranny, not wait for it to take hold, because once it takes hold, it's hard to get out. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. Again, I hope it was educational, and I really appreciate you being here. Don't forget 10thamendmentcenter.com/members or 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty for more info. Hope you're having an awesome Monday. You had a great weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.